Hey folks, welcome in. This is Chris with Up and Glow Digital. We're back with some more Power Platform content. In today's video, we're going to take a look at how to set up a recurring flow, which sends you an email every Monday morning. It's going to send you information about requests that you have due that week. In this case, we are pretending to be kind of a website management company. You might have stakeholders submitting requests that have specific due dates that might be expedited. We want you first thing Monday morning to have a report in your inbox that shows you what you have coming up that next week. So it's going to look at today's date plus 4 days to cover a whole work week. And then what team members are assigned to which tasks, so you can easily see if somebody maybe is going to be overworked or doesn't have any tasks assigned to them, and you can spread out work appropriately. What we're going to do is use a SharePoint list. We're not going to go into how to set that up, but just we have a kind of a placeholder SharePoint list with some dummy data here. We're going to walk through how to set up a recurring flow and how to scope the data that you get from SharePoint to just at a specific time frame, and then how to select pieces of that information like the team member or the title from that data, and then put that information into an HTML format, which then we send out through the email here in Power Automate. So without further ado, let's go. Alrighty folks, welcome into SharePoint. I wanted to do a quick overview of the SharePoint list that we're going to use as our data source for this video. So in this kind of fake scenario, we're pretending to be like a web management company. Maybe you have a website and your team is responsible for making updates from a bunch of stakeholders. So these are the type of requests really at a high level that you might see. We have a title field, a request type, which is a drop-down field. So there's maybe half a dozen options. The desired completion date, assigned team member. Again, this is not using a people picker field at the moment. It's just a drop-down with a handful of team members. The current status of the ask and whether or not expedited service is needed. So that's it for the SharePoint list. Nice and simple. Next, let's pop over to Power Automate and start on this flow. Here in Power Automate, we're going to create our new flow. So I'm over here on the My Flows tab. I'm going to go to New Flow, and I'm going to choose Schedule Cloudflow in this case. So what I'm anticipating for this email is that maybe Monday mornings, your team gets an email and it shows you all of the asks that you have scheduled to go live this coming week. That's kind of the scenario we're after. So in this case, we can start the email. We're going to do it today, even though today's a Friday that I'm working on this. But let's pretend it's going to hit every Monday morning, and then it's going to look forward like the next 5 days and determine which items you have due to be completed in those next 5 days, and it's going to give you a little report of those. So let's do weekly to do. It's going to be our flow name. Again, don't worry too much about the starting date and time unless you know it right off the bat. You can actually change this once you've created your flow. And then we want this to repeat once a week. I'm actually going to end up testing it, so you can just click the test button and trigger it whenever you want. But in theory, I want it once a week, and I want it to go on Monday mornings. And so actually it looks like this is disabling them. So by default, it's all of them. So on Monday every week. Okay, let's create. All right, our flow's created. And here is some of the information that we entered in when we were creating the flow initially. You can pick the interval, how often it goes, and kind of what the frequency is. So this is going to be once a week. I will select the time zone. I think that's helpful. Most of my team is Pacific time zone, but we do have folks elsewhere in the country. And so for now, I'm going to do that. Start time, again, this was chosen in that first one. It's going to start next Monday, but we'll trigger it whenever we want to. And then this is where you can select the time. So looks like kind of sometimes referred to as like military time in the US. We're going to start at hour 0. So that's like midnight. Actually, let's do 1 a.m. That's going to be 1 a.m. on Mondays. We'll get a report of what's coming up this week. And I think you can specify the minutes. So 1 a.m. on Monday every week. So that's it for our recurrence. And what we're going to do next is add a get items step, which gets us all the data from our SharePoint list. And then once we have all that data, we can kind of slice it however we want. So we can look at the number of requests we have upcoming. We can look at which team members are potentially assigned to those requests to kind of get a sense of folks' workload. And so that's going to be the next step. And once we have the items, we're going to calculate the variables we need and then ultimately send an email. And so I will put together maybe the email first with just some static info. I'm not going to spend too much time creating the HTML and the CSS for the email because we have some other videos on that. And there are a lot of great resources online This video is just going to focus on how could you take an email and replace static values with actual dynamic values from your SharePoint list. So I will go ahead and create that email, show you what it looks like, and then we're going to kind of work backwards, get our data from the flow, and put it into the email. So I went ahead and added my send an email step. It's just going to myself at the moment with the subject of upcoming work. And I know AI is a polarizing subject these days. This was a good use case I found. If you have a tool that you like, an AI tool, and it knows your data. In this case, I had Claude create the dummy data for my SharePoint list, and it knew the Excel that I was referring to, and I said, hey, can you give me an output email that I'm going to use in Power Automate? And so this is what it gave me. This is what the ultimate output will look like. And so what it looks like now, that code in Power Automate, is actually this. So there are some pieces that we're going to go through and add in our flow. So we're going to select the start date and the end date. Again, we're going to kind of have these be dynamic. So it'll be today, since this email is going to send on Monday morning. Today will be the start date, and then the end date is going to be today plus kind of 4 working days. And then as you can see here, the rest of this is static except for the actual task data is going to be dynamic. And then the team member and their assigned task number will be dynamic too. So this is what this Power Automate email looks like right now. That's what this output gives me, is that blank email. And now we're going to go through and add those pieces of data and then fit those pieces of data into this table so that it ultimately looks more like this. Before I go to my SharePoint list and get all of my data, I'm going to specify the specific date range. And so this will help ensure that we just pull data we care about, especially if your list gets really big. It's important that you query it properly so you're not pulling in potentially thousands of rows of data. So I'm going to start by trying to initialize a variable here. And this first variable is going to be our start date. And I'm going to kind of give it the same name here. And it's going to be a string ultimately. We're going to kind of have to convert a date format to a string. And so here is the format that we're going to use. I'm going to come in here to value, and I'm going to use the expression. This helps us get a lot of like the JavaScript-esque functions right out of the box. And so the first one is called, format date and time. The reason we do this is because Power Automate is going to use UTC format by default, and I'd like to have it all be Pacific Standard Time. And so what I need to do next is within here, I'm going to convert the UTC now function, which is going to get us kind of the current date right now. And we're going to convert that to Pacific Standard Time. So next thing I'm going to do is a convert from UTC function. And that's going to take 2 parameters. It's going to say, what are you converting currently? And so that's the UTC now timestamp. And then what do you want to convert it to? Pacific Standard Time. So we have that conversion. And then after that, the second argument for our format date time function is what kind of timing do you want that? So, or what sort of format, pardon me. So I'm going to do year, month, day, like that. And so this is going to get us the current timestamp it is right now, UTC formatted so that it is then in Pacific Standard Time and it is in this exact date format. So let's add that and then save and do a quick test. The test ran and it ran successfully. And so if you go in here and click start date, you can see your raw inputs. And here's our variable name, the type, and the value that it got. So this is July 17th of 2026, which it is today. And so we know that our start date looks correct. So the nice part about that is even though it might have been a little bit overkill to convert it, it's still possible that, I'm running this later and its UTC is in the future, and so it's the next day, and so it's converting it back to Pacific Standard Time. So either way, this looks good. We're going to do the same thing with this, a small tweak for the end date. All right, just like we did for start date, we're going to look for initializing a variable, and we're going to call this one end date. Same thing here, also a string. And the value is going to look similar, except that what we basically need to do is determine what's the date today and then add 4 days to it to capture, assuming it's a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. So first thing we're going to do is, again, we're going to format the date and time because we ultimately want it to look similar to our other date, our start date, so that when you compare them, it's easy to do that. And then we're going to use the add days function. And so this is going to say what's the current timestamp, and then how many days are we adding to that. And then just like we did before, we're going to convert UTC. And so our timestamp is UTC now. And we want that converted to Pacific Standard Time. That's good. And then, so we're inside the add days function. And so this is saying, okay, you have your timestamp today. How many more days do you want to add to it? In our case, we want to add 4. And then the last part is formatting it for the format date time function. And that's going to be very similar to our previous variable. Okay, add that. And then let's do a quick test. Our test ran, so we've got our start and our end date. So again, start date is today, the 17th of July, and our end date is the 21st of July. So because this includes the original day, there are 5 days total, the 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th, and 21st. So we've got our basically Monday through Friday dates. Again, it's a Friday, so this is a little bit confusing, but when this runs, it's going to run Monday morning, so it'll be Monday will be the first day, Friday will be the last day. So our dates are good. Now let's go find our data and query it. After our 2 variables are initialized, we're actually going to go get our items from SharePoint. So if you type in the get items within actions, you'll see get items for SharePoint. It'll make you select whichever connection you want to use. I've got my Alpenglow one. And then it's going to ask you where your list is at. I'll choose the SharePoint site. And then it'll load all of your list names up. Web team requests was the list I wanted to use. And you don't have to specify anything else, but by default, this is going to pull in everything in your list. And so this is where it's really important if you have a giant list that you query it or filter it. And so you only get specific items. Otherwise, you're going to get everything in your list, and it could just take a long time for this to run. So in our case, we want only to query the data with, which is the day of our start date until the day of our end date. And so that is going to go right here into filter query. One of the things I want to call out is that in my experience, filter query is one of the most finicky fields in Power Automate. There are very explicit ways that you need to type things and need to make sure that your data types match. And one of the things I ran into with this particular list is that my field that I care about, if you go back here, is desired completion date. And this field name is actually a little bit long. And so what I want to do first is I'm going to run a test so we can see what this data comes back as from SharePoint without querying anything. So I'm going to save this and just run a test. And then we're going to take a look at what that field actually looks like, because it's a little bit different. You have to do something special with spaces. And I think the field is capped at 32 characters when it comes back. And so we're going to take a look at what the field looks like, and then we're going to use that specific value in our filter query. So we're going to give us a second to run, and then we'll take a look at the data. All right, that ran. And so you will notice that you get a warning which says like, hey, you're not limiting or filtering your query at all. So you're going to get everything, and that's potentially a lot of content like we talked about before. Okay, so we'll ignore that for now. Here's my get items. This is, if I look at the output, it's going to show me everything that my list sent back. And so this is a bunch of stuff about the list or the environment. If you go down to body and value, this is an array of objects that is one object per kind of SharePoint row. And so here's the title, for example. But what I care about here is this field. So desired completion D. So you can see that it truncates my actual field name, and it also replaces spaces with kind of this unique set of characters. So what I want to do is, because this is the field I care about, I need to ensure that when I reference it, I match it explicitly to that. So I'm going to copy that, and then we're going to go back to our flow, and we're going to edit our filter query using that exact column name reference. Most of the times when I'm doing something that's a little bit more complicated like this, I like to go to the expression field and type things in here, but this was giving me trouble. Copilot wasn't helping, so we're just going to type it out here in the filter query string field. And what I'm going to do is grab that column name. So again, this is copied exactly from what SharePoint gave us, not what you see in SharePoint, but what the actual data comes through as. So we're going to compare this column, and we want it to be greater than or equal to our start date. And so the way that you can reference variables when you're typing in here is an @ curly braces, and then you type variables, and then you give it the name of the variable. Start date, make sure that's wrapped in quotes, so it's a string. And then we want, so it needs to be, the completion date needs to be greater than or equal to our start date, and the completion date field needs to be less than or equal to our end date. So variables end date. And I think this is all case sensitive, so make sure that it matches up. The last thing that we want to do is when you save this, it's going to get mad at you. And the reason is because we need to convert these to strings. So I'm going to put single quotes around this, around that, around that. So even though we explicitly call them strings here when we're initializing the variables, for whatever reason, I don't know if Power Automate converts them somehow or why, but they don't come through, again, as strings necessarily. So I've wrapped those here so that we're going to compare the completion date is greater than or equal to our start date, and it's less than or equal to our end date. So let's save and test. All right, we ran the test. Everything seemed to be successful. So now I'm going to go into Get Items and look at the outputs. And this is going to show us what our filtered set of data looks like. So again, body value, this is going to be an array of items. And so when real quick, I go to the SharePoint list and see what we should see. So I've already filtered the completion date by today, the 17th, and the next 4 days. I actually don't have anything on the 21st, which is why I only have these 4 dates selected. So I should see 4 items in our data. So if I go in here, here's one item all the way down here. Here's a second item, third item, and then the last one should be this one. Fourth. Okay, cool. So we are getting the correct data back from SharePoint. And now we want to arrange that data in a way that we can show it in our email and it makes sense. So let's look at how to extract specific fields from the items that come back here and present that data ultimately in our email. So we've got 2 sets of data that we're going to work with. One is that first table, which shows all the tasks, the title, the completion day, whether or not it needs to be expedited. And that second table is a list of team members and how many requests they have assigned to them. So that second one is a little bit easier. So we're actually going to start with that. We'll eventually have 2 parallel branches running that are working on the 2 tables at the same time. But this one is a little bit more simple. And so we're going to start with getting our team member names, counting up the number of requests they have, and then putting that into the email. So let's start here after get items, after we have our data, with a select operation. So if you type select and then type data, you'll see select under data operation. And the array that we care about, or the data source, is going to be the body of our get items, which again, in this example, just had 4 items currently. And usually what you'd use this for is maybe you're mapping parts of this data and you're converting kind of this data format to a different data format. But we actually just want a list of specific data. We actually don't need to change that data at all. So I'm going to switch over here to text mode. And then I'm going to come in here to the function. Actually, I think I can do it through dynamic content. What I care about is under get items, the field name I care about is assigned team member, and I want the value of that. So not the field itself, but the actual value, which is going to be a text field with the team member's name. So if I save that, let's test it and see what it looks like. Test ran successfully. Now, if we open up select and we go to outputs, we can see a list of the names for the 4 items that are part of this data set. Sarah, Priya, Megan, and then Priya again. So you can imagine when you're getting your table ready, you don't want, in this case, Priya to show up in 2 different rows. You want to eventually combine these 2 values and just say Priya has 2 tasks. So that's what we're going to work on next. To help us out a little bit, I'm going to go ahead and rename select to select team members. And then this next step is going to be a compose action. Search for compose. And what we're going to do is take this list, which has all the names, and then create a distinct name list, or basically dedupe it. And so we just have unique values in the list. And so what we're going to do here, we're going to let's call this, instead of just compose, this is going to be our distinct members operation. And in here, we're going to insert expression, and we're going to use union, which compares multiple arrays. It's a trick to dedupe an array, and so it's expecting a couple different arguments, and we're actually just going to pass it the same list twice. So let me explain what that does in a second. So this is the select one, the output from that, and we're going to compare it to the output from select again. So what that's going to do is basically check and make sure each name appears in the list, but only keep the individual distinct unique values. It's not going to keep, in this case, Priya's name twice. It's just going to say, yes, Priya exists in this list, so we're going to keep her around. And then the second time she appears, they'll be like, oh, she's already in the list, we don't need her. So that will help dedupe our select members list and just have our distinct member name. So let's test it real quick to make sure that that actually does what we think it's going to do. Test ran. So again, here in our select members, this is our original list where we have Sarah, Priya, Megan, Priya again. And then here in our distinct members output, you can now see that Priya just appears once. And that's because we compared the list and said, hey, just give me the unique values. So now when we create our table, we'll just have one row per person with the number of tasks they are assigned. Okay, the next part gets a little bit tricky. What we're going to do is look at all of these items that are returned from SharePoint, find out when each member appears as the assigned person in that, and we're going to create an HTML row with their name and then the number of times they appear in the list. So it gets a little bit tricky, but we're going to take it nice and slow and do an apply to each loop next. So at a high level, what we're going to do is create one big long string that we ultimately put inside our HTML email. And that string is going to have table row code in it. And so you have one row per person. And so the first thing we want to do is just initialize a variable. And this needs to initialize, exist outside of our for loop because we don't want it to, of course, be initialized every time we loop through something. And we're going to call this one member rows. Like this. And at the moment, we don't actually need to assign a default value to it. We want it to be blank. And then as we loop through our data, we're going to basically append each data set to this variable and then eventually stick the whole variable inside the email. After we have our variable initialized, it's time to loop through our data. In this case, it's the list of people. So we're going to do an apply to each control, select that, and it's going to say, hey, what data are we looping through? In this case, it's the distinct members because we want to see how many times does each person appear in the SharePoint list. So here's our distinct members, and we want to compare the outputs of that. And so now we have our loop set up, and we want to add some actions inside of it. If you expand this little arrow, you'll have a chance to add steps inside of our loop. The first thing that we want to do is filter an array. Under data operation, filter an array. And the array we care about is the select member name array here. So this is going to have 4 values. Then we want the output from that step. And what we want to filter is kind of every time there's a name in this list. So if you come in here, just type in item. This will be each item kind of in that array. We want to check when that is equal to the item that it's being checked here in our apply to each, which is the distinct members item. So if you come in here, all the way to the bottom, the current item being checked in the apply to each. So this will check the 4 names against the 3 names. Every time one of the 4 names exists in this list, it'll basically get counted, which is why we should expect Priya to be counted twice. So we've got that done. And then the next thing we want to do is create our HTML string and append that to this member rows variable. After filter array, we're going to add another step. And this one is called the append to string variable step. And it's going to ask you to define the variable, which of course is member rows that you want to append this to, and then the value. And so this is where I wish Power Automate would allow HTML editing a little bit easier. It's kind of a pain. You're basically just using plain text. If you go in here to expressions, sometimes it gets mad at you because they're non-actual expressions. So again, if you know some HTML, this is helpful. If not, that's okay. A lot of the AI tools are great at generating basic HTML. But basically, so we're going to have, each time this loops through, we're going to have a single row, and we're going to have 2 cells. So again, the TR tag is the table row, whoops, and TD tags are for table cells. So the first cell in our row is going to be the person's name. And so in this case, it's going to be the value that we are looping through inside our apply to each loop. So again, this is going to hit every time for each person. So this might be Priya, this might be Megan, whatever it is. And then the second thing we want to do is determine how many times that person was found in the array. And so right here, the step before is filtering the array. So if we're using Priya as an example here, it filters this array to just 2 items because her name appears in this list twice. And so that's what it's doing here in the filter array. So basically we need to check the length of this array for each person. And that length will equate to 0, 1, 2, 3, etc. And so the easiest way to do that is probably in this case to go to the expression and you can just type length. And then inside the length function, you can go to dynamic content and you can look for the filter array. Where's that? Right here, filter array output. And this will give you the length of the array, aka how many times that person was found in the list. So real quick, I did a test so you can kind of see what it's doing in here. So within our apply to each, here is the array that we're filtering initially, which has the 4 names. The first loop, it looks like it's looking at Sarah. And so it trims this whole list down to just where Sarah's at. In this case, it's just that first row, so 1 time. The second loop is looking for Priya. You can see Priya appears here twice, so it pares it down to just those 2 times. The last time is Megan, and she, of course, just appears once. And so this is just appearing 1 time. And then when you look at the append to string array, if you go out here to outputs, you can see the first loop is, again, Sarah. So it creates a row for Sarah and the number 1 because she just is appearing 1 time. The second time, if the second loop already has Sarah's row there, and then it's adding Priya's row. Priya appeared twice, so it's got a 2 next to her. And then lastly, the third loop has Sarah's already, Priya's already, and then it adds, Megan's row right here with a 1 next to it. So the HTML looks good. Granted, it doesn't have any styling. So next we are going to add that to our send an email step. So when I'm working in HTML, unfortunately, the new designer just keeps letting me down. You'll insert data somewhere and then it'll kind of move it. And so I'm going to switch back to the old designer up here. And I'm going to add the variable. Now that's called the members rows variable, which is populated with each of the table row data from our apply to each. And I'm going to insert that in our table. Again, we aren't going to go through how to set up all of the styling and the tabling for this. So this was just a basic HTML table template that I had. And here's the table for our team member and assigned task. So this is, again, at the bottom of the email, the second table. And so right after this row, I want to insert our member rows variable. And so that's going to add extra table rows to this table. And so we should see these as the headers and then all of our data as subsequent rows. So let's test that and see what the email looks like. Our email sent successfully. So here on the left is the output with just no styling at all in those table row and table cell HTML tags. But we do see Sarah, Priya, and Megan with the correct number of assigned tasks. And then here on the right, I added some styling to kind of match the rest of my email. And so again, I don't want to waste too much time talking about the CSS, but just as an FYI, here's what our plain HTML row looked like after I added the styling. Just added some font size, some specific colors, padding, stuff like that. So you can screw around with it, create whatever you'd like. It's still not perfect. I probably wouldn't have these centered and things like that, but it should. Once you have the data, that's great. And then it's just tweaking the CSS from that point on. So I'm going to call this lower section good. And now we're going to do something kind of similar to create the table on the top. So now that we've got our table member list, we're going to create a parallel branch that's going to run alongside this for our tasks. So if you're in the new designer and you click or right click, you'll see add a parallel branch option. And you could do this a bunch of different ways. You could use an apply to each loop and go through each of the 4 items in our case that are returned here and kind of do the same thing here where you created a string. You went through apply to each and appended to the string and then added it, the variable to the email. One thing that's nice though is since we don't need to worry about like counting the number of requests, since we're not really consolidating data here, we can actually just use a select. So again, I have select favorited right now, but if you type select data, you'll see it under the data operation tab down here. And again, what this is often used for is mapping, but we don't really need to map it to a different value. We're just going to say, hey, I want this value. It's going to kind of automatically loop through all of the items here. Well, actually, let's select that first get items body value. So you can see value is singular. So it's going through each item in the array from get items, which is going to be 4 separate things. And it says, hey, what do you want to do with all this data? How do you want to present it? And then inside our map, again, I switched to text mode. And what we're going to do here is create our table. So similar to how we did with our string arrays, we're going to create our table row. And in this case, we have 4 items. We have the name, the request type, the desired published date, and then whether or not it's expedited. So I'm going to do TD. I'll try to do this quick. 2, 3, 4. Okay. So the first one is going to be the name of that kind of the request. So if I come in here, I can actually just do get items. I want the title of that get item. That's gonna be the first one. And the second one, I want the request type. So if I just go in here, request type value, I want that. The third one is going to be a little trickier. This is the date time. We'll keep this kind of, you know what, let's make it pretty, kind of how we did. So we're going to do a function, and we're going to format date and time. We're going to do it, because this is kind of how we did up here when we were getting the original start date and time. So if I'm going to look here for desired published date, I think is what we called it, desired completion date, it looks like. We're going to do that. And then the format, let's do something a little bit more simple. So let's do this format, which is just going to give us kind of a shorthand for the month and the day. Okay, so I got to make sure, do I have everything closed here? I think I do. Is it like that? Okay, got that for our third column. And our last column here is going to be the expedited value. So expedite needed, and the value for that. Okay. So let's save that. So basically what select does is it goes into each of the items in the array you give it, which is the 4 items from this output, goes into each and says, okay, I'm going to extract the title from the first one, the request type from the first one, etc. And then it's going to give you the outputs for all of those, depending on like the size of the array. So that'll make a little bit more sense. Oh, it doesn't like it. Okay, I've actually seen this happen a couple times. Sometimes what it wants you to do is wrap it in double quotes, so it's kind of like a string. This again, it's kind of like filter query where it's very finicky. So let's see if it likes this. And then we can take a look and see. Okay, great. So let's go ahead and rename it, and then let's test. So this is going to be called task rows is what this select's going to be, and let's go test it. Our test ran, and here we can see our outputs. So again, what it does is it gives us one body output, but it goes through each of the items in the array it was given and outputs data in the manner that we specified. So we have 4 rows, which is what we expected. For the first row, we've got our title property here, and then we have the request type. And here's July 17th. It was kind of that unique date format we gave it. Again, you could change this to whatever you'd like. And then yes or no, whether something is expedited. So each row looks like it has the right data. If you were going to really polish this up, I would probably format these to be sorted by this column. So you had like the most recent or soon to be published items at the top, or maybe the expedited items at the top. But nevertheless, for this particular use case, this looks good. So it kind of did everything that our apply to each did in just one step, which is because we didn't have to, again, compound and compare 2 lists and things like that. So it's much easier. So now what we want to do is add this output to the email. And what we need to do is join all of those 4 values together into one big string and plop that in the email. So since we're going to use, do some work in the email, I'm again going to swap back to the old designer. And one of the things that we need to do first is we have these 2 parallel branches running, but they don't both have access to the email that ultimately gets sent. And that's because the email at the moment is correlated with the left column. And so it only has access to the data here. This is barking at me. Again, it kind of gets rid of my quotes over here. It's kind of a pain in the butt. The better way to do this might be to concatenate a bunch of things. You might concatenate basically a bunch of strings. So the first string would be the HTML elements, and then you'd have the actual like power automate variable and then the elements again and stuff. But for now, I'm just going to keep adding these double quotes so that it thinks that this is valid JSON, and we'll run it and test it and make sure it works. But just know there might be a cleaner way to write this map function. But as I was mentioning, so the send an email exists here on the left-hand side, so it doesn't have access to this variable. So what we want to do is add a new step here, and you'll see that the parallel branches finally converge, and you can actually move this email down here. So now the email has access to everything from the left branch and the right branch. What we want to do here is add the output from our select to the bottom of the table here, which had our title, request type, due or due date, and expedite. These are the headers for that table. So we want to put it right here. And what we need to do, though, is because we saw that body was 4 separate rows, we need to be able to join them using thankfully, just the join operation so that they become one long string that we ultimately add to that table. So right here's where I want it. I'm going to go to my expression. I'm going to say join, and it's going to say, what do you want to join? And then I'm going to look for the output from my select task rows. And so that's going to loop through each of those rows, join them into one big long string, and that's what will render here in our table. So let's see how this looks. Right after I saved, I realized I made a mistake. Join needs 2 different parameters. What do you want to join, and then how do you want to join it? So I forgot, so let's do a comma here, and then you can choose how you want to join things. So if there's a list, you can have a semicolon and a space or a comma, but in our case, this is just one big long HTML string, so I'm just going to do blank, so nothing. But it did get mad at me because I forgot that second parameter. So let's save and test. Here's the output. So this is looking good. So this has the title, the request type, the due date or desired publish date, and whether or not it's expedited. So again, styling doesn't look great because we didn't do anything special to that HTML. I'm going to go back real quick and edit this. Go back here, save this. Oh, I'm already here. There are a couple different approaches you could take here. One, there's actually, if you want things nice and simple, there's actually a create HTML table action these days under data operations, I believe. And what this allows you to do is you choose the array. So in our case, it would be the same thing here. And then you can actually specify the columns you care about. So this could be like title, and then over here would be like the title from the each of the values, wherever title's at. Title here, and then you could go through and do this. The bummer is that you don't really have access to kind of this specific conditional HTML quite as easily as you do here. And so it is nice to know, but I like having the extra control. So what I'm going to do here is add a little bit of CSS to make this appear a little bit more stylish. And then I'll show you why I think that is advantageous for my particular use case. So I'll be right back. Here's the email with some of the updated styling I was talking about. So one of the things that, again, I like, I'll pull it over here. You can see this is what our select map function kind of looks like now. You can see it's a little bit messy. You have to escape, like if you're going to do inline styles, which you need to do, you kind of need to escape them, or it gets confused because it's kind of supposed to be JSON. But what it allows you to do is add things like down here. Where's this start at? There's an if statement. So what it checks is like, hey, if the value of expedited is yes, then give it this nice red color. If it's not yes, then it can just kind of be this like gray text color. And it allows you to apply some conditional styling to your table rows. And you just have a little bit more control more easily when you do it this route rather than the create HTML table step. You could also get a similar level of control by doing what we did over here, where we're basically looping through each request. We're adding each value, we're creating a table row and appending it. That would kind of give you the same sort of flexibility. This is nice because it's just one-stop shop, but it is, again, tricky because you have to kind of wrestle with Power Automate, especially the new designer. It strips out these little double quotes, so you have to keep adding them back in and things like that. But that's the reason that I like to use something like that. The last thing that I want to do is I'm going to check why this is overflowing a little bit. And then let's really quickly add our actual date variables in here. And then we're going to be pretty much done. I managed to fix up my table. The issue was, I think something happened in the new designer. Member rows was moved up above the header for it, and it just got the table all wonky. So just a reminder, if you're doing HTML stuff, I really would stick to the classic or old school designer, which is the one we're in now. The new one just has a bunch of problems moving things around. The last thing I'd like to do is up here at the top of my email, I have the date range start and date range end just as plain text, and I want to swap those out with variables. So let's do that now. So instead of just plain text, let me get rid of that. And I'm going to add an expression because I do want to present it nicely. The variables, again, have year, month, day, which we're not quite as accustomed to here. So I'm going to do a little format date time, and then I'm going to add in the actual date. Whoops. Let's see here, dynamic, our start date. And then the format is going to be, I like this one that we did for another part of our email, which is kind of the shorthand month and day. And so I'm actually going to copy this same thing, do that here. And then for date range end expression, same thing, except this is going to be the end date variable. And now I have that. So let's take a look at what's hopefully our final output. Here is our final output. So we've got our two dates there, kind of the shorthand format. We've got our request table, which is going to show things that are due today and for the next 5 days. In our case, we don't have anything on the 21st. And then we have a breakdown of what our team members are working on. So if I was going to polish this a little bit more, I'd probably add some branding or styling. I would probably arrange the due date. So have these items sorted by the due date with the most recent one or the soonest one to go live up top. And then I might sort this by maybe the team member that has the most assigned tasks on top. Again, there's a lot of little polish that you could do to make this truly production ready. But what I wanted to highlight in this video was how to grab data from SharePoint and filter it and then ultimately present it in an email. All right, folks, that does it for this video showing how to extract data from a SharePoint list, do a couple sort of mild data manipulations here in Power Automate, convert it to HTML, and then send it off as an email. We find this use case comes to us a lot with folks that just want automated reporting. Some of them are as simple as this, some are a little bit more complex. The nice thing is you could do this through SharePoint list. You could create a view and format it the way you want, but some folks just want it right in their inbox. They don't have to think about it. Every morning they get something, or every week on Monday they get something, and it helps them set up nicely for the week. So I hope you learned something new, and we will see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.